And now, it's time for learning more about our lives as students, our body as humans, and our future as happy, healthy people. The APU and AUV Podcast Network presents the Student Health and Happiness Podcast with your host, Russell Freeman.
Welcome, everyone, to our podcast today. I'm Dr. Russell Freeman. I'm a professor of health science and philosophy at American University in Vietnam and a chiropractic physician from the United States. This is part 2 of our health and happiness discussion on taking a closer look at music, its importance and influence in answering the question, why music? With our special guest today, Professor Ralph Millsap. Professor Millsap, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you.
When we left our show in our last episode, we were talking about some interesting connections between humanity and music, how in the cage of innovators such as John Cage, even silence can be considered music, or music can come from silence, and that in your definition, that music, as you call it, was auditory motion in time and space for the purpose of artistic expression. So can you give us an overview, Professor, about how did music evolve to where we are today?
Well, we discussed previously what likely happened with hunter-gatherers, and then we discover agriculture and get cities, and now music becomes more sophisticated. But we don't know what that music sounded like because people from the empires did not leave any written music or any notation that we understand. So we go from the empires into the medieval era. So Constantine will declare the United Roman Empire Christian in 313 of the Common Era, what most people call AD. And he says, we're all going to be Christian. And he says, you don't need to study anything but the Christian Bible. It gives you everything you possibly need, which is a lesson in the power of one person's decisions. Because out of that one decision, he gave Europe the medieval age, the Dark Ages, for 1,000 years. So the church had money, but most people were poor. A very large percentage of the population were peasants. So what happens? This money flows to musicians and artists who are producing work for the church. So these peasants will go to church, and the leaders of the church wanted it to look beautiful. And it did. But that's where musicians could find work. But it was all about praising God. And so there's this pope named Gregory who designed something called Gregorian chant, and it's this kind of prayerful chanting music that really doesn't have a great deal of appeal. We go through the medieval age with very little secular music.
May I ask a question about that? Was the purpose of those Gregorian chants for the chanters, or were they to create a consensus and community for the community?
It was for both. It was to put the person singing the chant in a prayerful state, but also for those that may be attending the service. So that happens, and then Martin Luther gives us the Reformation, then the Counter-Reformation, and the church starts throwing a great deal of money at artists, musicians, artisans, and now musicians get paid by the church, but they're getting paid enough money that they can start working on other things, secular work. And so it's out of that period, the Baroque era, that we get opera, that we get contrapuntal music with Bach, which he performs fugues like Row, Row, Row Your Boat, but in a much more sophisticated state. Following that, we get the classical era that begins with Haydn in 1750, and now he gives us strict form. He gives us the contemporary form for a symphony and 4 movements. He also designs sonata form, which becomes the form for some movements, for concerti and for symphonies, which composers still use today. And then we move into the Romantic era, where we get great melodies and rich harmonies. Then in the Impressionist era, where composers show that they've been influenced by Freud and this idea that there's this dreamlike subconscious world that's influencing us. From there, we go to contemporary composers, which begin to explore music in a much broader sense. And included in that would be composers like John Cage.
So it sounds like music has been a business for a really long time.
It is a business, which is why so many people that study music don't make a living with music. It's a very difficult task.
Are there certain kinds of people that are more prone to being musicians than others?
I don't think I can identify a personality type, but I can say that different forms, different genre appeal to a variety of personalities. And each of us might have a work of music that we think is the most beautiful we ever heard, and someone else may hate it. I think maybe what we should consider in this regard is what is the purpose of music? What is it? What does it really do for us? That conversation becomes increasingly interesting when we consider the discovery of neurotheology, where the neuroscientists and the psychiatrists tell us that you can take a person and you wire them up and study their brain. While they're wired up, you tell them to pray or to put themselves in a religious meditation of their denomination, and a particular part of the brain lights up. You could take that same person, put them back in the tube, and tell them just to lie quietly, don't think about anything. And you can put on some religious music or have someone recite a prayer, and that same part of the brain lights up, which calls into question this very concept of spirituality. All right, is it possible that we like music because it's lighting up a certain part of our brain? It's giving us a stimulus that we get nowhere else. I can't answer that. I just throw that out there for our audience and for everyone to consider. But I do know that we use music for many, many different things. Sometimes it's just for the aesthetics. We like music because it's pretty. We like how it sounds. For some people, reaching back to the hunter-gatherers, for some people it was ceremonial. They would have a big kill and they had a certain music or a rhythm that they would play. We get to the medieval age, and now we have sacred and secular music with an emphasis on the sacred music. And then as we move forward in history, secular music becomes more important. It's clear that there's some unifying quality in music, that we can go to certain groups and play their national anthem, or certain religious groups and play some music that is common to all of them, and the group will have a shared experience. But what we do know is that music evokes emotion, which says that it gives us a certain feeling. And maybe that's why we like some music.
I would be interested to know what the difference is, both for the creator of music or the player and the listener, between music that is mathematical, that is predictable and has a certain form, and what we would call typical music, beginning, a middle, and an end. And then the more spontaneous kind of music, as John Cage would have presented, perhaps, where it's more off the cuff, you could say. It's more spontaneous and a product of being in the moment. You don't really know what you're going to play, and you don't really know as a listener what's coming next. What's the difference in experience, first from the point of view of the player, of the musician, in playing a piece that's been written, that you know exactly what you're going to play, as compared to playing something spontaneous, creative, or jamming, as we used to call it in the old days?
Wynton Marsalis is completely articulate on this subject. He's a man that's won a Grammy in the same year in the classical category and the jazz category. And he did it as a very young man. But he said something that completely befuddled me. He said, classical music is easy. All you have to do is play what's on the page. That's all you have to worry about. It's when you move into jazz that music becomes difficult and challenging. And that's where he's dedicated his life. There's someone that has said that music teaches you to think from the heart, which I'd like to think that music is more than that music is something more than a feeling, but I can't prove that true. But I'll give you the words of Yuzhou Wang, who's this extraordinary pianist. She's now in her 30s. She was a child prodigy. She recently performed a concert that was 4.5 hours long, in which she performed all of Rachmaninoff's concerti from memory. And it was a phenomenal experience. And she said people would come backstage and say, I have no words. And she would respond, exactly. Maybe we should just leave it alone. And Louis Armstrong, the great jazz trumpeter, the man that was in many respects the father of jazz and American music, said there's only two kinds of music, good and bad.
Well, with that, I guess that's good news, because it means I don't have to learn very much to be an active listener and really enjoy music and make it part of my life.
Enjoy it as you will.
Thank you for your time today, Professor. I've really enjoyed our conversation about music and how important it is in our lives. And I hope you enjoyed it. So come back and see us real soon. Have a nice day. Bye now.